Now we know who the truly hardy people in the community are. If you've come out this evening, we know you're as interested in this subject as we are. I'm Paul Reville. I'm a member of the faculty here, and we're thrilled to see so many of you come out for this session on income inequality in America's schools. It's a fascinating subject for me. Personally, this is a subject ever since I left my position as Secretary of Education in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. I've been talking about the kinds of issues that our authors are reporting about tonight. It's a felicitous coincidence for us as a faculty to have both our research side and our practice side talking about the same set of issues. So I'm very eager to get to our conversation this evening. I thank you for coming out. I thank our authors for joining us and our panelists for being with us as well. And thank all of you for being part of yet another Askwith Forum, which is the Harvard Graduate School of Education's continuing effort to bring out the public and to bring out our community to talk about the issues of the day in public education. The way in which we're going to proceed this evening is as follows. Our two authors are going to present their summary of their writing and their work, first talking about the problem statement, second talking about their prescription for what to do about it. Then they have a couple of short videos. Then we're going to invite our panel up to join us, and we're going to have a panel discussion for a period of time. And then with the balance of time that's left over to us after that point, we will have a discussion with you, members of the audience, and there are microphones placed in the audience for that purpose. So I'm first going to introduce our two authors, Greg Duncan and Richard Murnane. Greg Duncan holds the title of Distinguished Professor in the School of Education at the University of California, Irvine. His research is focused on the impacts of family and neighborhood conditions on children's cognitive and behavioral development. He's also studied the role of school entry skills and behaviors on later school achievement and attainment and the effects of increasing income inequality on schools and children's life chances. Duncan was president of the Population Association of America in 2008 and the Society for Research and Child Development between 2009 and 2011. He was elected to the National Academy of Sciences in 2010. He received his PhD in economics from the University of Michigan and spent the first 35 years of his career at the University of Michigan and Northwestern University. Richard Murnane is somebody who is well-known and honored member of our own community here, an economist. He's been on the Hugsey faculty for 30 years. He holds the Thompson Chair of Education and Society and is a research associate at the National Bureau of Economics Research. One of his longtime research interests has been the impact of technological change on the skills Americans need to earn a decent living. He and MIT professor Frank Levy have written 2 books on this topic. Dick spent the 2001-2 school year working for the Boston Public Schools, and one product of his work was the HGSE DataWise initiative and the book DataWise, which he edited with HGSE colleagues Catherine Burdett and Liz City. For the past 6 years, Dick has co-chaired with Greg Duncan a large research project on social inequality and educational disadvantage. More than 50 scholars contributed to the edited volume With or Opportunity, published in 2011. Restoring Opportunity, which we'll be discussing this evening, is the second product of this research project. So, without any further ado, let me welcome to the stage Greg Duncan.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. We've divided things up so that I'm the problem and Dick is the solution. We're both going to deliver remarks for just about 4 or 5 minutes. I'm trying to cover the first half of the book, which condenses our gigantic With or Opportunity book down to about 75 pages. The topic is about income inequality and the challenge that income inequality is posing for American schools. So let me grab this. There we go. The fact that income inequality has increased, I think, is familiar to everybody. This is just showing what has happened over the last 40 years between 1970 and 2010. You can display this in different ways, but if you divide the income distribution up between the top 20% and the bottom 80%, up at the top there, the 80th percentile, income was about $100,000 in 1970. In inflation-adjusted dollars, that rose by about $25,000 over the next 40 years. Down at the 20th percentile, the opposite happened. The incomes declined from about $37,000 to $26,000. So the gap between the top and the bottom, we're not talking about the top 1% here, we're talking about the top 20%, the top 10% in these various slides that I'll present. So the gap increased by about 50%. At the same time, if you track kids' achievement and attainment, what you find are that the achievement and attainment gaps by income over this same period have increased also quite substantially. Sean Reardon in our volume had a wonderful chapter that tracked achievement gaps on achievement test scores over the last 50 years. This is just showing college graduation rates. A national survey that had rounds in the late 70s where they started with teenagers, followed them for quite a number of years. If you look at their family income at age 14 and then track them for 10 years and see how many graduated from college by age 24 and divide those kids up into who was in the bottom 25% of the income distribution, the top 25% of the income distribution. Back in for kids who were adolescents in the mid to late 70s, 5% of the low-income kids graduated, 36% of the high-income kids graduated. Of course, you'd expect higher graduation rates for higher-income families, but look at what's happened over the last, over this 20-plus year period. What you see is improvement at the bottom. Actually, there is improvement in the bottom in the achievement scores for low-income kids. The problem is the top of the income distribution, the top 20%. This is 15 million kids living in families with incomes in the top segment of the income distribution. Those graduation rates, those achievement levels have gone up much faster. So the gap that you see in the mid-90s, these are kids who were adolescents in the mid-90s who were completing their schooling about 10 years ago. That gap has increased a lot. So what's the story? There may not be a story. Income inequality has increased and educational achievement and attainment gaps by income have increased. It's a correlation. A lot of other things have been going on. There's been a huge growth in single-parent family status among low-income kids. Maybe it's single-parent family status and not the income. A lot of the book was devoted to trying to piece together what the story is, determining whether there are any links between income inequality changes and changes in the gaps between high and low-income kids. Certainly, one part of the story is this direct arrow between income inequality and kids' achievement and attainment. As family incomes have diverged between the top and the bottom, expenditures have diverged markedly. High-income families in the top 20% of the income distribution, are now spending $9,000 per child per year on enrichment expenditures, things like high-quality child care, maybe private school, computers, books, things like that, $9,000 per year, whereas families in the bottom 20% of the income distribution are spending about $1,300. So more than $9,000 and about $1,300. It's a huge gap, and it leads to a huge difference at the point of school entry in school readiness between high and low-income kids. So family income is certainly part of what's going on. But we want to bring in schools. That was the point of the book, to try to bring in a role of schools. To what extent were schools changing in ways that accounted for these increasing gaps? And what could we do about that? So to understand what the demands on schools are and the nature of school functioning over the last 40 years, it's helpful to go back before thinking about income inequality to the source of income inequality. There are a number of things that contributed to the increase in income inequality, but probably the most important are the technological changes and the globalization that started taking place in the 1970s, really hit hard in the 1980s, that have essentially hollowed out the middle of the income distribution in terms of jobs. There are a lot of very low-paying jobs. There are a substantial number of high-paying jobs that require a lot more skill, a lot higher levels of education, and a lot more in the way of literacy levels, numeracy, complex thinking, communication skills, things like that. So if you think about that leading to inequality, at the same time, it's upping the ante on what we're demanding from schools. So it's not a matter of, if only we could get back to schools the way they were 30 years ago. Schools 30 years ago weren't teaching a sophisticated enough level of skills that would enable someone now to get a middle-class job. So the ante has been upped in terms of what we're demanding of schools. But at the same time, changes that have taken place from income inequality have burdened schools substantially. So one of the things that income inequality has brought about is an increase in residential segregation by income. So if you look now relative to 40 years ago, what you see is that poor kids are much more likely to be living near other poor kids than before. Rich kids are more residentially isolated than used to be the case. By and large, kids still attend local schools, so the same thing has happened in schools. Low-income schools are more uniformly low income. The student bodies are more uniformly low income. High-income schools, more uniformly high income. So if you think about the kind of burdens that places on schools serving low-income kids, it concentrates achievement and behavior problems more than before. It makes it more difficult to attract and retain high-quality teachers. So at the very time that we're upping the ante on schools and what they have to do, we're creating conditions in those schools that make it harder and harder to teach those skills. So that's the problem, and Dick's going to tell us the solution.
Thanks, Greg. Thank you all for being here. I know it wasn't easy for many of you to get here, and it may be difficult for you to get home. So thanks for coming. So again, as Greg described, one of the consequences of increasing income inequality is increasing school segregation by income. That is, low-income students are more likely to have classmates who are low income than was the case in the past. So we call these high-poverty schools. So clearly it would be, for lots of reasons, better if we didn't have this concentration of high-poverty schools, but we do. And the question is, can anything be done to improve education of low-income children when they're concentrated? Well, what Greg and I did, we knew the research literature, and what we looked for were interventions that had been conducted at some scale. They weren't in a single school. They were conducted at some scale. They were durable. They had been around for a while. And they had been evaluated using cutting-edge methods and had been shown to improve academic outcomes for low-income children. And that led us to focus on particularly the Boston pre-K program that's in about 70 elementary schools in Boston, the University of Chicago charter school campuses, and the New York City small schools of choice. That there's about 200 of them that were developed in in New York over the last decade, starting in 2001. Now, when you ask what do these have in common? Well, we suggest they have several things in common. First, they really take advantage of new research evidence. For example, lots has been learned over the last decade or two about what contributes to healthy child development and adolescent development. You really see that evidence used in these schools. We know much more about how to teach kids to learn to read, and not only learn to read well enough to follow directions, which does not provide you the basis for a good job today, but learning to make inferences from text learning to do internet searches where you get thousands of responses and how to make reasoned judgments about which of those responses are accurate and helpful. And we know much more about what constitutes effective professional development and coaching. One of the other things is all of these schools, all of these interventions took place in an environment in which the adults in these schools experienced consistently strong school support. In other words, opportunities to improve their teaching and the way that they serve children. And second, what we call sensible accountability. Now, these go together, we would argue. It's not one path or the other. They're essentially together. We've lots of evidence now, if you have accountability without supports, you don't get desirable outcomes. If you push teachers to do things, if their jobs depend on doing things they don't know how to do, then that does not serve children well. Also, simply providing supports without accountability typically doesn't do the job because we adults change very reluctantly. And so some idea that we really need to change our practice, and we have lots of supports to bring about that change, is a critical combination. So these three sets of interventions, and we'll show you two of the videos from the Boston Pre-K program and the New York Schools of Choice. If you want to watch them again, they're on our website, restoringopportunity.com, as is a third video about the Chicago charter schools. These are, I think, very powerful interventions. The evidence is good, but of course, these are striking exceptions. Very few poor children have access to these kinds of high-quality education. And the question is, why is that the case, given we have learned a lot more about what needs to be done at the school level to educate children, particularly low-income children, well? Well, the reason is we as a nation haven't figured out how to develop systems that provide this combination of consistent school supports and sensible accountability that is necessary. Now, what do we mean by sensible accountability? Just a word, since accountability is a complicated concept. Well, I think a necessary condition for an accountability system to be sensible is that it's attractive for highly skilled teachers to want to work in high-poverty schools. I mean, that's at least a minimally necessary condition. Okay, so are there reasons for at least cautious optimism that we can do better by low-income children, that we can make these exceptions not so much exceptions, but more what every child, including low-income children, have a right to expect? Well, I think there are several things how to do that. I don't think anyone really knows. But there are some building blocks to use in that effort. And the first is, again, the fact that we have these existence proofs we describe in the book suggests it can be done. It is not impossible to educate even high concentrations of low-income children well. The second is we have these research evidence about what has to happen at the school level. We know much more about that than we did 20 years ago. Third, accountability. Now, accountability is a complicated term, but I would argue that whatever you think of No Child Left Behind, and I would argue No Child Left Behind needs dramatic revisions, it still is an important step towards thinking we need to educate all children, not only those from attractive backgrounds. I think it's making accountability, sensible accountability is a big challenge, but accountability is important. And finally, there are a great many organizations now, the Boston Teacher Residency, New Leaders for New Schools. There are many, many, many of them that have a focus on providing supports of different kinds to schools, particularly schools serving low-income children. So that's a plus. But the question is how to utilize those, how to provide mechanisms for schools to access the kind of supports they need is still a substantial challenge. So we're going to show you these two videos now. And just a warning, after the first one, I'm going to ask you to talk for 2 minutes with somebody nearby about what did you see that you thought was interesting. And perhaps particularly, how did you see the combination of consistent school supports and sensible accountability playing out in this Boston pre-K program? Could we have the first one?
Mather is the first public elementary school in North America, founded in 1639 in Boston.
Good morning, Mather. Today is Tuesday.
We are over 600 children.
Good morning to the sunshine.
I teach a group of 20 4- and 5-year-olds.
About 30% are Vietnamese, 25% Cape Verdean,
Hispanic, African American,
Haitian, Jamaican, some Caucasian.
Good morning. Jackie, do you want to do the calendar?
This is considered a pretty high trauma location.
Good job.
A little over 80% qualify for free and reduced lunch. About 20% of our children qualify for special education services.
The notion that the public schools would provide a universal preschool program is sort of new in this country. Traditionally, public schools really start in kindergarten through 12th grade. There was a fair amount of research at looking at the interaction between the quality of preschool and long-term outcomes. And basically, it's the investment in high-quality preschool that made a difference. You need a strong curriculum. Strong math and literacy, thematic content is critical. I really think content matters.
I want you to get ready for story, get to where you can see. The Little Red Hen Makes a Pizza.
The Little Red Hen Makes a Pizza is a fantastic text for children.
Does anybody have a pizza pan?
It allows for a lot of exploration into many math skills, science skills, and literacy skills.
You have to start with the dough. She put her flour into a big mixing bowl. She stirred, stir with me.
It's very interactive.
There is real pizza dough on the table for you to play with and see what it feels like and see what kind of pizza you might be able to make.
And it allows for a lot of activities.
It's really clear to me that kids' work is really play.
And some cup of tea.
It is through play that they're learning all kinds of different things.
This is warm, this one's cool.
This one's cool. Yeah, it is a little cooler than this one, you're right. Why don't you go on this side, Jackie? There you go.
I think about the role of the teacher all the time.
Deanna, what did you notice?
There's a heart on it.
The role is to be engaged and present. It is to build relationship with kids, listen to the kids, observe the kids, be ready to ask just the right question in the right moment. It's about being a reflective practitioner.
So this is the big castle and then this is your house?
This side is a house and that side is a building.
Coaching plays a critical role in supporting teachers to really think reflectively about their practice.
Raise a quiet hand if you would like to say what you saw in Rameka's work. Joseph.
I love it.
By observing them, gathering notes, noticing the practice that they're doing well in, things that they're struggling with, and giving them feedback on this process that they're really able to reflect. I think that there is a lot of materials here that reaffirms what you're doing, and also some places where you can really stretch and go deeper with some of the things that you're facilitating with the kids.
You have to think about what are the supports and structures that help you support teachers. We use something called the National Association for the Education of Young Children accreditation system. That is a pretty comprehensive approach to looking at what good early care and education quality should look like. We have 80 schools that we have access to and teachers, and we can do professional development in a much more quality way.
Do you feel like you're using lots of different variety of responses and approaches? When you're mentoring, you're actually using criteria from NAYC that is very in-depth.
We hired community-based coaches. The coach really is there to help facilitate the teacher's thinking, and we do 2-hour trainings once a month with teachers.
All right, who remembers something that we've read from the Salmon book?
Like belly.
So when we sit in a group, how does it work if you want to say something?
The hand-raising strategy that you're using is to remind them because they're very excited to share ideas. And
it's not that effective, though.
Okay.
If you all talk at once, I cannot hear you. I cannot understand you.
Something else that you could do that I observed in another classroom, a teacher used a visual. So she had just a little picture of a person raising their hand, and kids notice it and they immediately respond and raise their hand. We can really have a huge impact on what's going to happen for kids later on.
They're very bright, yes. Even the youngest ones. Eyes are watching, ears are listening. Finally, early childhood is being recognized, and people understand that this is a critical point in childhood development. And so we should be accountable. I think that's great.
So that's the first video. I'd like, as I mentioned before, spend 2 minutes talking to somebody nearby about what did you see? Perhaps particularly, what was the elements of supports and accountability that you observed? And so 2 minutes, please. Thanks so much for coming. So you've met my wife. Very cool. We may need to give them a mic. Okay, thank you. So now we'd like to show you one more video before we turn to our panel. And these are of focusing on a high school in downtown Brooklyn that is one of 200 small schools of choice that was started in New York City starting around 2001. They came from a design competition under which small groups of educators with community partners, they had to have community partners, were invited to put together a proposal for a new small high schools with a particular theme, and those plans that were solid, the developers of those plans received funding to develop the school, and there's not 200 of them, and the evidence is quite striking that it's improved high school graduation rates substantially among low-income students in New York City. And as you'll see, there's supports and accountability here too, but they look a bit different in a high school. Jason.
IDs first. Thank you. I was ready. Thank you.
Morning, Summer. How are you?
The Urban Assembly School for Law and Justice is a small school in downtown Brooklyn. We have about 454 students and a cap of about 120 students in our incoming freshman class.
What I think we did well in New York City was not only to create smaller units of school, small schools, but to look at the variety of systems that intersect with school. It's really a grand act of redesign of what we think about as secondary education.
Have a good day. Morning. Morning, Victoria. Morning. Have a good day.
One of the untold stories of the small schools is that we required every school to begin with a community partner.
We have a really strong partnership with our founding partner, which is a law firm in Manhattan.
In 9th grade, the students have multiple opportunities to go there and to really think about the law and being a lawyer.
We did a trial where we talked about cases, and we did the defendant and the prosecutor, and we got to see real-life lawyers display that case as well.
When you have the support of the community, I think it makes for a richer learning environment. So this whole theme of law, justice, speaking up for yourself, they're very interested in.
Literacy is a huge component of our 9th grade here.
We have students who come in multiple grades below grade level. So we really think about building a year that has explicit literacy strategies throughout every unit and that builds upon previous units.
Daniel, can you remind us what the pre-reading procedures are?
What are the predictions you can make about what this would be about?
The skills of annotation and analysis and questioning in an English class work in a science class. They're just annotating and analyzing different things.
Some hair can be sticking off of the slide. It's not a problem.
Literacy is your ability to understand the content that's in front of you and make connections.
But look at that tiny piece, look. See, look, keep looking, and I'm gonna move it, look. See it?
It's not focused.
Is it lightly and tightly?
The literacy strategies that are used, not only do they translate from subject to subject, but they also allow students to use literacy in a completely different way.
So what did you add to your definition?
Two sides are congruent in the included angles.
We have the agenda in front of us. We're going to try to keep to time.
In grade team meetings, we discuss what's called Kid Talk, where we present a certain student and we figure out how they're performing and how we can make them more successful here at the school. Today, I was requested to submit an activity that I would be giving students in my class. This is designed to help students go through the scientific thinking and writing that is involved when you are putting together a lab report. And one student that we were discussing is in one of those classes.
We're going to break up into 2 different groups. And then what you should be doing is having a 10-minute conversation of how this can be modified.
Each teacher in the team meeting gave me specific feedback on where I can make certain modifications to help this student and any other student access the material a little bit more.
A lot of those skills that were used before can be used here in other content areas. We're teaching kids how to break down information, right? We're teaching them how to use scaffolds, how to be critical thinkers.
The student benefits from having some things read aloud, so whether that's in a small group with a teacher, one-on-one, that's another alternative modification.
That experience for me was very genuine. We are all here to help every student that's in front of us, so therefore I take the criticism extremely well.
Next week, bring in work that you've modified. So thinking about some of the work that we've done today and applying it to a different assignment, or taking loosely some of these ideas and applying them.
Our student population typically don't come from college-going families. Our staff create a sense that college is possible and probable. And that begins really with freshman year, so that there's that sense from the beginning that we have the highest expectations.
We're going to start to think about the things that you are interested in studying, maybe when you go to college, or the types of careers that you might want to have when you leave SLJ.
I think that what our staff does is we're the parent with a master's degree at the kitchen table for 100 kids.
Put a star next to the one that interests you the most.
There's a caring relationship. There's that sort of parental, you have to do it. We are not going to let you veer away. In our family, this is what happens when you're this age. You apply to college, and you do it very well. 100% of the students here apply to college. About 90% actually matriculate.
How many people in here know somebody who is in college or has been to college?
Really don't be afraid of the challenge, because we've got young people who really are capable of doing amazing things.
I had science, technology, engineering, and math.
We have to create structures that enable them to do that. Constantly looking at where kids are in skills development, constantly diagnosing where they are, and then providing that support in real time.
Okay, good, perfect.
Thank you. Let me turn this now back to Paul.
Well, thank you, Dick and Greg. We appreciate the presentations and the videos that help set the stage for what's now going to be a conversation with our distinguished panelists, who I would ask to join me on stage while I'm introducing them. Unfortunately, one of our panelists, one of our graduates actually here, Sonja Santelises, who's with the Education Trust, is a casualty of the weather today, so Sonja was unable to join us, unfortunately. However, we are thrilled to have the two panelists that we have with us, and later on in the conversation I'm going to invite the two authors to join us for the question and answer period. But we have with us Dean Martha Minow, who is the Morgan and Helen Chu Dean and Professor at Harvard Law School, where she's taught since 1981. Martha is an expert in human rights with a focus on members of racial and religious minorities, and women, children, and persons with disabilities. Her scholarship also addresses private military contractors, management of mass torts, transitional justice, and law, culture, and social change. She serves as vice chair of the board of Legal Services Corporation. She is a graduate of the University of Michigan, has her master's degree here from the Harvard Graduate School of Education, and a law degree from Yale. She also served as a law clerk to Judge David Bazelon and Justice Thurgood Marshall. She's joined on the panel by Clarence Page. Clarence, excuse me. Sorry for that. I was in a legal frame of mind.
You weren't the first. You weren't the
Legal
first.
frame of mind. Who joins us, I guess, from Washington, but also by extension from Chicago. So this is a subtropical trip for you from Chicago. We appreciate your being here. He, as you know, is a columnist and editorial writer for the Chicago Tribune. He's winner of the 1989 Pulitzer Prize for commentary. He writes a column for the Chicago Tribune that is syndicated to more than 100 newspapers. His other honors include Lifetime Achievement Awards from the National Society of Newspaper Columnists, the Chicago Headline Club, and the National Association of Black Journalists. He's made frequent appearances on NPR, PBS NewsHour, the McLaughlin Group, CNN, MSNBC, and BET's Lead Story, among other programs. Page's book, Showing My Color, Impolite Essays on Race and Identity, was published in 1996 by HarperCollins. So thank you both for joining us, and I'm going to come sit with you so we can have a conversation.
Just join us.
And let me open it up this way and give you each a chance to comment broadly on what we've just heard and the book that the authors have spoken about, and ask you, from the standpoint of their problem statement, give us a reaction. I mean, broadly speaking, at least as applies to schools, part of the message is schools alone as currently constituted aren't sufficient to doing the job of closing the inequality gap in terms of lifetime opportunities for students. And what, as you hear the prescription, what do you think are the sort of legal, financial, practical, political implications of the kind of prescription that the authors suggest? Do you think it's realistic and feasible in our time to think about something like that? Martha, why don't you start us off?
Sure. Well, it's such a powerful book and project for at least 3 reasons. One, it's absolutely unblinking in terms of the situation. 2, it actually is hopeful and has very concrete steps that make sense, that are supported by research. And the third thing that I think makes this an important book is that it mixes the narratives of individual stories that you can remember, along with statistical, other kinds of evidence. And that suggests to me it has a possibility of reaching people, because we know that, unfortunately, a lot of very good research doesn't reach people, and a lot of stories don't seem to actually carry weight in policy settings. So those are the things that I think make this book especially important. In terms of the content, it's a couple of things that are not there that are interesting to me. Race isn't much discussed. We're really talking about income. And I don't think that's wrong. I just think that's really notable. You know, my last book was, and I came here to talk about it, was In Brown's Wake, Legacies of Brown versus Board of Education. It's not that the country's moved on. We have not moved on. So that's just something I would raise as a question. We once upon a time had a legal framework that allowed for challenging the way schools were run because of the treatment of race. It's not clear we do anymore. We don't have much of a framework. We don't have any framework for dealing with class, at least if you're talking about constitutions. You know, maybe state constitutions, the adequacy litigation that has proceeded now in 3 waves in this country to try to tackle the school expenditure. This book offers some very concrete content if state courts were going to prescribe, here's what an adequate school is. Most courts shy away from doing that because they don't feel competent to actually say what an adequate school is. Massachusetts is a great example. You know, great glowing opinion from the Supreme Judicial Court saying we really should have adequate schools, but we think the legislature will figure that out. So I think that if we took these elements, particularly the sensible accountability and the sustained support, that's a pretty good prescription for something that a court actually could prescribe without actually mandating, getting in there and saying you have to do it this way. And that's why I particularly like the New York Small School Initiative, because it was a set of criteria that many different actors could propose their way of achieving it. And that's something I could imagine a state court actually doing, saying these are the criteria, we're not going to go in there and run the schools. Because the courts tried to do that and didn't work very well. That's probably enough for now.
Okay, thank you. Clarence, your kind of top-level response?
Well, thank you for saying top level. Some people would say I'm a bottom feeder, but that's just the way people feel about the press these days. I'm glad you brought up race. Now I don't have to, but it is an interesting point because when you look at the results of Brown v. Board, it's very significant that the court came around at a time when the public was more ready for Brown v. Board or school desegregation than before. This was after Jackie Robinson. This is after the defeat of Nazism abroad and our national shame over racism at home, the desegregation of the military, et cetera. At the same time, not all the country was ready. Virginia kept their schools segregated despite the Supreme Court for at least a decade, 20 years.
Another 20 years.
A whole generation grew up. In fact, a whole generation of black students was denied an education because they couldn't get to a school. I won't go into all the details of that, but the point being that the law is great, but the law has to work in conjunction with society. I don't think we really want judges to be deciding school, teacher, class assignments, this kind of thing. That's for the community, the professionals, families, et cetera. And Abraham Maslow said, it's the only tool you have is a hammer, all problems begin to look like nails. And that's how people tend to view the law too often. Well, we'll just pass a law to solve this problem. You've got to prepare the community as well. You asked before the program started about the political environment for change or for obstructing change, et cetera. And being a word man, I'm very impressed with the the use of words and setting a narrative and changing narratives. Frank Luntz, that well-known spin doctor, whose slogan is, "It's not what you say, it's what others hear." Very important. If you as an educator come in to a group of parents and say, we are here to optimize and maximize your educational outcomes, et cetera, you are likely to be shoved out the door. But if you say, we want to work with you to improve learning, that's a whole different ballgame. And I think that what we have with these mammoth problems like education is that there's a lot of cynicism with the public about the ability for any kind of change, positive change to happen. We've got Reverend Eugene Rivers here in the audience today. I got to point you out, Gene, because we met back in the 90s when he changed the narrative about urban violence here in Boston and became Newsweek's cover, national hero, et cetera. People say, "How'd you do it?" You know, but the fact of the matter was just by pulling different elements of the community together, public, private, charitable churches, et cetera. The 10-point plan established a new model for communities dealing with youth crime at a time when Boston, like Chicago, is now plagued with this problem. But it shows that even when you do pull people together and change the narrative, there's no magic bullet. You still got to keep working at it because conditions change and people and time change. In Chicago, we changed the model of public housing and the ability for those communities to function. And once you change a couple of public housing developments, then the public said, well, maybe change is possible. So the same thing happens with schools. When people see schools like what you have displayed on the screen here, they see that change is possible. And there are things that can be done. And so they don't feel like all the money that we spend on education is just good money chasing, or good money chasing after a bad problem. There's what we found in politics in recent years is that the public isn't anti-tax if the tax is going to pay for something that they like, something that they think works. To quote a famous Tea Party slogan, "Keep the government's hands off my Medicare." Yeah. Everybody wants better schools. There's a consensus nationally. We need to improve our schools. We need to save education. There is also a universal disdain for paying for improving the schools. However, if you show the money works, if a change is possible, that change can happen and can work with people in order to facilitate it, then you build up a political consensus for change. I think one message needs to be gotten out is, and this message comes across very well in the first half of the book, is the American dream is under siege. Simple as that. The American dream as we know it, as we envision it, upward mobility, if you're a Republican, or income inequality, if you're a Democrat. This is the way our language has become polarized these days. Marco Rubio says upward mobility, Barack Obama says income inequality. It's the same thing, people. Same thing. But our politics is polarized, our language is polarized. But the fact is, when I was coming out of high school, and I didn't go to Harvard. I know I look brilliant, I did not go to Harvard. I went to what Richard Nixon would call a good Republican cloth coat state university, Ohio University, Harvard on the Hocking, as we call it, or Berkeley of the backwoods. And when I went in 1965, I had to go back and check the record, and it is true. 1965, my tuition for my first semester was $770. And we thought that was just expensive as hell. But my working class family, my janitor father and my cook mother and me, working in a steel mill in the summertime, we paid that tuition. Today, tuition is 10 times that. Steel mill jobs aren't there. Same thing with so much of, well, intact families. I mean, I can go on and on. The problem's outlined in the book. This is reality, folks. Upward mobility has stalled. That's why you've got that curve that suddenly starts going down in the 70s. And why wasn't race mentioned here? I'm glad it wasn't. We have recast poverty about 50 years ago, after LBJ's war on poverty. We colorized poverty. It started out as a problem in Appalachia, LBJ and his photo ops. By the mid-60s with Watts, et cetera, it became a black problem inner city. But you know what? You've seen Charles Murray's latest book here a couple of years ago, all about, he has redeemed himself for the bell curve, in my view, of this book. It's about, the subtitle is White America 1960 to 2010, 2012. But what it's about is that all of these pathologies and income inequality and upward mobility, stalling, et cetera, that we identify with black folks and Hispanics is happening with white folks. Shock.
Single parents.
Single parenting among women who are not high school graduates, children born out of wedlock, the rate is now over 60%. Which is approaching the overall rate for black out-of-wedlock births. And for college graduates, black, white, Hispanic, et cetera, the out-of-wedlock birth rate has hardly budged since the 60s, ladies and gentlemen. Aren't you a moral bunch? For all your talk, you college kids, about your licentious, free love, blah, 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 you know, the out-of-wedlock birth rate less than 10% on the whole. It's remarkable. Anyway, I know I'm wandering.
Yeah, that's all right. That's all right.
I'm a pundit. You let me.
That's okay. That's all right.
And I will talk forever.
All right. Well,
let me just say one thing about unions.
All right. Unions.
Unions. Yeah, because I know you want to talk politics. Let me say this: what I've learned about unions, education, government, politicians, parents. Unions want a role in improving the schools. Mm-hmm. Unions do not want to be demonized. Teachers don't want to be demonized. Teachers' unions doubly don't want to be demonized. They want to be, and I say this coming from a family full of teachers, so I argue with them all the time because I'm pro-voucher. We can talk about that some other time. But I just
You are getting perfect.
I just love to cause trouble at Thanksgiving, you know, because I believe in choice. The more choices we have, that's why I love these choice schools, which are not voucher. We're talking public school choice. But anyway, unions want to have a role in improving the schools. Unions want to believe and want you to know they're part of the solution, not the problem. But sometimes they do get in the way of change because of their responsibility to their members, et cetera. But unions can be worked with, and I think I know I bring this up because in New York, I know with the small schools project, there's been some back and forth. There's back and forth in every city. Heaven knows Chicago has. Its share of clashes between unions and City Hall.
Well, let me bring it back to the schools, if I can.
Go ahead.
Okay, so we're the part of the argument here has to do with, you know, as a nation, we've set for some time now high standards for all students. We've been at work at it for over 20 years. We now have growing income inequality outside of the schools, and we look at the outcomes and the results in schools, and they're, as Greg has shown us, widely disparate as well. So we haven't gotten there using a whole slew of reforms, including choice and standards and accountability. We haven't been effective at closing this gap, and in fact, in some respects, it's widening. And so what the authors are at least suggesting in terms of their outline here is that we've got to pay attention to how we reconstruct an education system beyond the conventional 20th century school that we've inherited, that in certain respects differentiates between children. It meets children where they are and it gives them what they need. It pays attention to, for example, out-of-school learning opportunities, which in the outline that Greg presented are being highly invested in by affluent families who have all manner of enrichments available to them and their children, and other children by accident of birth get next to nothing. So as we contemplate an education system in the current political climate that we live in that might differentiate between children in order to realize our national objective of getting everybody ready for meaningful employment in the 21st century, what kinds of challenges are we likely to run into, Martha?
Well, I'm so glad you emphasized that point about the differential expenditures based on class that parents contribute for out-of-school learning. Because on the one hand, there's a little bit of a tension in the book's review, which is, of course, accurate, about money not mattering so much. And it's true. It's disappointing for lots of us that more money per student has not actually correlated with better outcomes in some overall gross sense when you get more fine-grained. Ron Ferguson's work is very good on the importance of, if you're paying more for teachers who have better education, you actually can have better outcomes. But what does seem to me in tension there is seeing that finding with this recognition that wealthy parents are spending a whole lot more on out-of-school learning. So money matters. The question is, how's the money being spent?
Because learning is learning, whether it's in school or out of school.
Absolutely. And right now, kids spend much more time learning on devices. And that's poor kids and wealthy kids who spend about the same time on screens. The difference from the research that I've seen is not time on screens. The difference is access to adults and coaches. And are you in a community with other people who help you as you navigate? Now, whether it's educational stuff or it's games or whatever, that's the difference, and that's reflected in those expenditures. And I do think that we're going to have to confront the impact of technology and the way it's going to blow up the factory model of schooling. We're not going to have schools that are organized around a factory model. We're going to have learning opportunities. And learning opportunities, then the question is, can kids have access to caring adults who know them, who coach them, who help them get back up when something didn't work? Again, another thing that's very interesting about kids' use of games and screen time, same amount of time on games, regardless of income. Difference, wealthier kids, if they're frustrated, they get help, they keep progressing. Poorer kids, they're frustrated, they downshift to an easier level. They don't stop playing the game. So the question is, how can you get that kind of as-needed help? That seems to me the critical question. And the focus on the help for the helpers in this book seems to me absolutely essential. How do you provide the supports for teachers, but also for coaches, for librarians, for Boys and Girls Club people, so that they actually provide that kind of get back on task advice that helps kids continue and persist. I spent part of today with representatives from City Year. City Year started here, actually, started by 2 Harvard Law School graduates. City Year is, I think, one of the answers. If you provide enough intense one-on-one or one-on-5 support for kids with enthusiastic, committed young people who really care about them and know about them, I think that would make a world of difference. Who applaud the kids as they come into school, who applaud the teachers when they come into school. And so I think that some of the ideas in the book lend themselves to solutions that require us to break open the school as it's been currently constructed, bring different people in, have kids out of school learning, but in continuous relationship with adults.
Yeah, you make me think of summer and the summer learning loss, which is well documented. And goes beyond the sort of technology example that you gave, but just the example that affluent children may be going to camp for 6, 8 weeks all summer, each week a different kind of activity. Other children don't have access to that kind of learning and the kind of coaching and the kind of stimulation that goes on there. And it turns out that the gaps that develop as a result of those opportunities or lack thereof are every bit as important as what happens in school. School, after all, is only 20% of children's waking hours during the period of time in which they're in school. That means the other 80% of learning happens outside of school, non-school learning opportunities. Clarence, the book talks about, and the videos show, a new kind of school with new roles for teachers. And I wonder if you think this is a kind of school that current school systems are the best vehicle to deliver. And what are the implications for teachers of the kind of work that we saw described in the videos that we looked at this evening?
Well, I think the kind of model we see on the screen here is already being implemented in some schools, particularly more affluent schools, and a lot of private schools. It is not implemented that widely in the schools where students need them the most. These students from communities and families that are not giving them that 24/7 reinforcement, positive reinforcement that we would like to see. And what impressed me that I find consistent about all 3 of the schools spotlighted in the video and talked about in the book are, I should say videos, the 3 videos, including the one you didn't see here, are that first of all, the teacher-pupil ratio is favorable. You have, at the high schools, you've got 2 teachers. Well, you've got a teacher and a paraprofessional assistant. This is not uncommon in high-functioning schools. And also team teaching. Teachers getting together themselves to reinforce each other, compare notes, evaluate each other in a positive way. Keeps them up to date, and you don't get the situations where the younger, less experienced teachers are suffering or isolated, or if you find that older ones feel isolated, and you don't get the high turnover problem as much. And also the, well, I love how the youngsters here, and this is talked about more in the book, the interactive learning and the tactile experience. We were talking beforehand about one of my educational pet peeves, which is not really talked about in the book either, is the gender gap. It's being talked more and more in our general society, very candidly, about how women are performing better than men. Girls are performing better than boys. And having raised a son who is my spitting image, I can speak authoritatively on this. He came home in his middle school years and declared that paying attention in class, that's a girl thing. And dear old dad, starts, we had this out-of-body experience where my father's voice was coming out of my mouth in describing to him. But there is this growing gender gap, and there's more talk now about a lot of guys need more of a tactile experience, more hands-on
applied
education.
learning.
Yeah, applied learning. Maybe a lot of even Pat Buchanan and I agreed on the McLaughlin group the other week when this subject came up, and we're talking about the disappearance of vocational education. There are a lot of guys who, considering what plumbers are paid these days, I wish my son would do it. Well, these are things we got to talk honestly about. In the past, we couldn't be so candid about it without being sexist or without being in denial that there are differences. I think now we're at the stage where we can talk candidly about those. And so I was happy to see this being addressed in these schools as well.
Martha, what do you see as obstacles that need to be overcome in scaling the kind of school experiences that were described here so that they would become the rule rather than the exception?
Well, first I just have to say that on the tactile experience, there are lots of girls that would benefit from it too, and the multi-dimensional learning that we saw, that the book really documents, the problem-based learning, the apply the knowledge. How many kids say, when am I ever going to use this algebra? And what a difference it is when you have a project-based learning where you're using it, and that's why you need to learn it. I think the obstacles, we've sort of touched on it already. Well, the biggest obstacle is that there's a kind of giving up attitude among the general American public. We've tried everything, schools don't work, whatever. And although I'm a supporter of vouchers and charters, largely because I think it gives people a sense of hope and a sense of, some control over the situation. I think that the danger is there's this constant effort in school reform to find the magic bullet, the one thing that's going to fix things, and nothing's going to fix things. And so then there's this high expectations and the disappointment. That's the biggest obstacle. So the phrase in the book, and Dick used it about sustained support. The word sustained, that would be a revolution to use that in the context of school reform. Nothing is sustained. We're going to try this for a year, we're going to try that for a year, we're going to have a superintendent for 3 years, then we're going to have another superintendent. There's nothing sustained, and there's no long-term anything. So I think that's the biggest obstacle, how to give people a sense of hope, and then at the same time a demand that you got to give it time, you got to give it time.
Do you see promising legal strategies that might create an imperative for people to make the scope and scale of changes that are called for here, or the investments that might trail on making those kinds of commitments? You mentioned the adequacy cases and the degree of difficulty there. Are there other strategies that we should be thinking about?
Well, I do think No Child Left Behind has to be revised. When you have waivers for 40 states, 40 plus states, the states are walking with their feet here. But I also agree that accountability really matters. You need sensible accountability. So I think there needs to be political commitment? Can we get the political commitment to actually reopen what should be a national framework for accountability? And I think that there's enough knowledge, this book is such a great contribution to that, that what does it look like to have sensible accountability measures? I think that law is often used as a catch-all phrase for something that's going to make us do something that we don't want to do. You know, law is either court-based, which we've already identified as having limitations, or it's the product of democratic deliberation. And I think that the laws that are going to make a difference in schools are going to be the ones that are going to open up opportunity for people to have jobs as teachers where they can see a good life being a teacher. You know, why do I have 75 alums of Teach for America at Harvard Law School as students? Why do I have them? Because they're frustrated from what they see in the schools. They want to see change, so they come to law school. And look, we're going to help them, and they're going to open up charter schools, and they're going to do lots of great things. But why aren't they teachers in schools? Why is there no path for them to be rewarded for staying in schools?
We haven't built a sustaining profession.
That's right. And so I'm interested in what combination of laws, incentives, policies, you know, attitude change. When you have the Finnish schools that are, you know, producing such great results, well, being a teacher is held up not only with social regard, but with financial regard in Finland in a way that it's not in this country.
Clarence, putting on your pundit hat again, if you ever took it off, the whole national discourse that we have on the kind of change that would be indicated here. We now have a conversation going on internationally. We have the Pope talking about income inequality. We have the President of the United States talking about inequality. We have this book about income inequality and the implications for schools. So when we get down to that school level, how do we frame a set of arguments that would make it compelling for the public to embrace either transformational change or significant investments that would bring about the kind of delivery on the promise of education reform, which was, after all, that we would educate all of our children to be ready to succeed in a high-skilled, high-knowledge economy?
Right. I think we need to acquaint Americans with the diversity of America. I'm glad you brought up Finland, because there is a subtext conversation, if you will, going on about what does American diversity have to do with our divide over these common issues and problems like education, where everybody agrees we need to improve our schools. But why aren't we as good at it as the more homogeneous societies of Europe, for example? And why does poverty take on a black face, for example? Why do we get hung up on desegregating schools by race and don't address class, just desegregating by class? Because, I mean, I think Dr. King found after the Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act were passed and he moved on to fight poverty, it was like the old Southern joke I won't go into now, but the punchline is basically, Pastor, now you done stop preaching and going to meddling. That was what America told Dr. King, essentially. Mayor Daley in Chicago, who was all in favor of desegregating down, by race down south, when King started talking about open housing and breaking down housing discrimination in Chicago, said, now you done going to meddling. And anyway, I can go on and on. The fact is that we are talking about some very deep-rooted problems that go beyond education, but they're the foundation of our inability to build a consensus around improving education. When you've got, well, we have to deal with this. This is why, I mean, here in Boston, of all places, back in the 70s, I'm old enough to remember when school busing was an issue here in Boston. And lo and behold, journalists and others who investigated found that it wasn't so much race as it was class.
Absolutely.
And the Harvards versus Charlestown, et cetera, and all, I won't go into. You all know the sociology around here better than I do, but it's very real, and it got in the way of school reform here in Boston and around the rest of the country. And so I think it's still with us. We don't like to talk about race these days. We like to talk about American diversity in a real sense. We saw Mitt Romney's campaign didn't want to treat race as an important issue or even address it to the point of even campaigning among minorities. And look what that got him. The fireworks are still over at Boston Harbor, unlit. for his victory celebration. It's still a subtext of our issues, and we have to deal with it.
So that makes me think about two things. One, because the effort to follow Brown versus Board of Education with litigation claiming that differential treatment on the basis of class is also a violation of the Equal Protection Clause, because that failed, because the Supreme Court said, no, it's not. Ironically, it is now completely lawful to assign students to school based on their socioeconomic status. There is no problem with that. So actually, in Cambridge, in Berkeley, in school systems that seem to be in university towns, there are plans that do just that. So I'd like to see a national discussion. Why don't we do that? Mm-hmm. Richard Kallenberg's work suggests that if you have a mix of socioeconomic status among the students, everybody does better. So there's no legal problem with that. This is not law as a solution, but law at least is not standing in the way, which it does sometimes. So let's put that on the table. Yeah. And then just more generally, I mean, I couldn't agree more with Clarence that the sense of the unspoken diversity issue in this country that produces votes about referenda overrides and so forth, that people say, well, I'm not voting for an increase in taxes because those are not my kids. This is not my kids. These are somebody else's kids. Well, what contributes to that? And I think that there is the ongoing questions about discrimination, immigration, these are not ours. But I also think there's another problem, which is the privatization. The language that says these are just private consumption. Taxes are what I pay to get my kid's education, but I'm not going to pay it for somebody else's kid. Well, we've lost the way to talk about this is common good. We're all benefited when there's an educated.
Yeah. Which is, I think, part of the reason that many people frame this in economic terms. In other words, if you aren't motivated by the moral argument for educating all kids to high standards, the economic argument is that the economy can't prosper. And the children who are unprepared will have to be carried in other ways. And
the American dream dies.
Yeah.
The very notion that a younger generation doing better than us old folks dies. And we're finding in our polling now for the first time more Americans, especially young folks, saying that they don't expect to do as well as their parents. This is a reversal of our national identity.
Well, and that's what the lack of social mobility produces, is those kind of attitudes. We're running out of time. We have time for some questions. So there are microphones in the aisles. We'd ask you to identify yourself. And please, we don't have time for speeches, but we'd love questions. I'd ask our two authors to join us on stage too, in case some of the questions are directed to them. It's a provocative topic, so please feel free to raise any questions with any of our panelists that you'd like to bring up.
Want them to the microphone?
Yeah, no, there are microphones in the aisles.
Okay.
Okay.
Because a couple of people had hands up there.
Okay. Yes, sir.
Hi, I'm Josh. I'm a master's candidate here at the School of Education in Education Policy Management. Thank you very much for being here. The interventions that you point out in a lot of these strategies seem to be hyper-local in urban environments, mainly seems like northeastern urban locales where they can pull these levers. I'm curious, two questions. How do these types of interventions translate in rural contexts? And second, what, if anything, is or should be the federal role in pushing out these types of things that the research has shown works across the country?
Thank you.
So let me answer. You're right that these are all in big cities. In our search for interventions that met the criteria of durable, some scale, more than one school, strong evaluations, and made a difference, we didn't find any. Doesn't mean that there aren't good programs in rural areas, but we didn't find any that met those criteria.
It is true that there is a successful pre-K program in Tulsa, Oklahoma, which isn't exactly rural, but it's certainly true that research tends to be conducted much more in urban settings than rural settings. And as Dick says, it's not to say that that successful interventions are not possible, but we just don't
have examples of them. We wanted to stick to very strong evidence.
Okay.
He asked about the federal role as well. The role of the
federal role, yeah. Do you want to comment on that?
That's a tough one. You know, one thing we haven't talked about is are the Common Core state standards, right? Which are, it's not a federal initiative. It's really a local initiative from business and state.
That in itself is a subject of controversy, but yes.
Right.
But it's a compact across the country. It's
right. But if you think about general supports that we need to embrace, in our view, we simply can't not conform to the kind of goals, the learning goals that are in the Common Core state standards. And you know, it's a way in which you can carry across goals from one grade to another, from one school to another, from one state to another. So it's very much in the spirit of a common approach, although it's not really a federal approach.
But I mean, I do think that given that we have an intergovernmental approach to education policy and the federal government has the bully pulpit, they may pay the minor share of the bill, but they have the pulpit. This kind of reframing around issues of the economy and issues of social mobility can't really happen without some larger framing and leadership at the federal level, it seems to me. What the exact policies are, I think, would be subject for discussion. Reverend Rivers, and then we'll go to the microphone.
Real quick, I'm a preacher.
Okay.
You can project.
Right. Had you further disaggregated the data that you referred to, and factored in race, how might that have affected your approaches, and how might your proposals been further modified? Have race been a factor?
I think in the, as you saw in the two videos, and the third video would be equally true, which was Chicago charter schools, the vast majority of the children, overwhelming majority, 95%, are children of color. And I think that's, you know, because while race and income are not the same in the U.S., in fact, one of the aspects of that is different is this increasing residential segregation by income, a phenomenon very profound in the 1980s. That took place among African American families to the greater extent than it did among other ethnic groups. So they're not the same, but nonetheless, it is the case that a black child is much more likely to grow up in a low-income family than is a white child. And for that reason, I think most of these interventions are primarily about improving education for children of color. And it's the same in these urban settings. It would not be, as the gentleman before spoke,
if we looked at rural settings.
So we try in the book to take this fairly long historical view. If you look over the last 40 years, at the time when the achievement gap is growing by income, it's declining by race, right? So back in around 1970, the race gap was much bigger than the income gap. Now it's just the reverse. So it's not to say that the race gap has gone away. Indeed, it's still very substantial. But this income gap has become even greater. And for the residential changes, at the very time that residential segregation by income is increasing, in general, residential segregation by race has declined. So I think a lot of us were very surprised by the differential paths because of the confound between race and class, but this is really a class-based set of trends.
Just to be even more complicated, as Professor Henry Louis Gates points out, the economic gap since the 80s between black haves and have-nots is now wider than that between blacks and whites. This is a sign of black progress, that we now have our own income gap in the black community. And again, segregation by income. Because it's just a fact of the matter is, you know, black folks are as likely to move away from poor folks as white folks are.
Okay. Yes, sir.
My name is Sam Holtzman. I'm the Director of Faculty Development at a small art and design college in LA, just here on vacation. My question is predicated on
came for the weather.
Tell me about it. My question is predicated on the idea posited that a pathway to success for these schools leads towards higher education. In the past 10 years, we've seen the onus for success shift from initially placed on the students to being placed on teachers. Now, the idea of accountability being placed on the schools. I'm curious if we look ahead towards higher education and sort of map backwards to the schools themselves, what do we do about the doorway into our schools and try and create a pathway that is accessible to all types of learners in a way that allows for inclusion, access, and equal opportunity?
You're talking at the higher education level?
Well, given that we're pointing towards higher education and that some of the models that were offered are ones clearly that have a common thread of being pragmatic and practically based towards, for example, the one we saw about tying together all the courses based on the idea of law, with the idea that that'll get students into higher education. Presuming that what we consider to be success for K through 12 education is access to college. My question is, and it's partly in terms of the ability to legislate this, also the idea of looking at accountability. How do we put accountability onto the school systems to increase their doorway for all types of learners?
Let me just answer very briefly. I think vocational education has been, not only has a new name, career and technical education, but the attempt is to have a different focus as well. Rather than preparing students for narrow vocational jobs that may or may not exist when they graduate, rather the recognition is that a lot of young people don't learn core skills like reading and writing and through traditional curricula. But when these core skills are taught in the context of particular sets of occupations, they do a good deal better. Just one example, when the Education Reform Act of 1993 was passed in Massachusetts, there were a lot of vocational educators who said this is going to be the end of vocational education because our students are not going to be able to pass the MCAS, the exit exams, to graduate. But to the credit of those educators, there have been substantial improvements in career and technical education, such that one of our graduates did a nice doctoral thesis last year showing that for kids at risk, a career, they had a higher probability of passing the exit exams and graduating if they were in a career and technical education program than if they were in a conventional college prep program.
Just a footnote on that, it is also the case, and I was present at those protests and on the Board of Education at the time when people said, don't apply these standards to vocational school students. Now, on average, our career technical high schools outperform our comprehensive high schools on those traditional accountability measures. The only other thing I'd say with respect to your question is I do think there is growing attention at the higher education level not to make the accountability indicator so much access into college, but successful completion of college. Are we preparing students to actually not only just get in, because many are getting in but they're underprepared when they get there and don't succeed even beyond the first year, but how well are you doing? And in Massachusetts, we've just instituted policies that actually reward colleges financially, our state universities and colleges, for keeping people persisting through and actually achieving graduation, which is, after all, the promise that goes along with higher education is predicated on the idea that you're going to get the degree, not just that you get in. So I think we are making some progress in that area.
I'm not sure this will happen, but here's a hopeful thought, that the distinction between technical and career education and other is going to collapse. And the reason that I say that, again, is project-based learning. And that's happening at the higher education level as well as in K through 12. And partly it's the desire of students. Students want to make stuff. Students want to see stuff happen. But it's also because we find that there's more durable learning when people actually use more senses. And so I think that's something that, I don't know if it's going to happen, but I think it could happen. I mean, here at Harvard University is in the midst of a massive effort to remake undergraduate education. How? To move away from lectures and move to hands-on learning. This is revolution here. A big change from 30 years ago where you talk about skills. You couldn't do skills at Harvard. Now it's all the rage, you know. How can we give access to a 3D printer? How can we give people a chance to actually be on a team and be problem solving? Why? The students want it. Also, they learn better. And there's a better pathway to a long-term career.
Okay, we've got a few more questions left and very little time. So I'm going to ask you to be brief, and we'll try and get through the 3 people who are with us with short responses from our panel.
Yeah, so my name's Nina. I'm a senior at the college, and we spoke about the importance of caring relationships, but in neither of the videos or programs did we see any sort of parent involvement. So I was wondering what you thought was going to be the role of families in successful intervention programs or new school curricula and ideas moving forward.
Thank you.
All of these schools try very hard to involve parents. The older the children get, the more difficult it is to make happen. And also, a lot of these parents they're single parents working 2 jobs. They care deeply, but just their lives are so difficult, it's hard to get there.
Okay, thank you. It's a good question. We don't have time to give it as much attention as it deserves, but I appreciate you putting it on the table. Yes, sir.
Hello, my name's Steve Warren. I'd like to qualify as one of the poor white children from projects, 7 different schools by 8th grade. I really liked what I had to see here. It's been a topic of mine for many years. I love the attention to the attractive careers for the educators and the coaching. And one of my concerns is that there's a lot of emphasis on the tactile and the analytical and the cognitive, and which the literacy helps with education. It's kind of like saying learning to read helps you, learn. But there wasn't much emphasis on the cooperation and the collaboration between the children, and I was wondering why that is. It seems to be almost avoided, and it makes me think of many conversations I've had with many people over the years who are like, you're not going to tell me how to raise my kids, and I hope that's not it, because it's basically the solution that I've been looking at all my life, and I've finally gotten some of that parenting in the last couple of years. Thank you.
Let's Martha, you talked about project-based learning. I mean, isn't part of it collaboration?
Absolutely, and it's 21st century skills include teamwork, collaboration, learning to take criticism. I think it's essential. And we also find that kids learn more when they teach. Duh. Right. It's the secret that all of us teachers have known for a long time. So actually creating settings where, the medical schools learned this long ago. See one, do one, teach one. You teach what you learn, and so therefore pairs, study groups, project-based learning, collaboration, I think it is very essential.
I would just say, watch the Chicago video. It's on the website. The culture of this school is dominated by the STIC values. STIC is self-control, tolerance, integrity, something, and kindness.
Collaboration.
Collaboration.
Collaboration. There you go.
That's what I couldn't remember.
There you go.
That was it.
It's the power of the group.
Great.
All right, thank you. Last question.
Hi, so my background, I'm actually a graduate student in mathematics. My background is not so much in education. And I'm kind of wondering, there was a brief mention of summer programs, and so I'm wondering for summer programs and after-school programs, specifically for STEM fields, if there have been more positive results for matriculation rates with curriculum-based programs, kind of to supplement what's lacking in schools, or enrichment-based programs, which are kind of targeted towards teaching the types of things you wouldn't see in any high school program. So something like advanced math or engineering or robotics, like those types of programs which are more effective for students in the long run.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, by and large, the evaluation literature on after-school programs isn't that positive. I think there are a lot that are fairly unfocused. It's not to say that there aren't examples of good ones, but I don't think the research base, it's the usual academic cop-out, and the research base isn't really strong enough to give a good answer to that question.
Well, I think we know why. And it's contrast with the enrichment opportunities that are in these schools we highlighted. In these schools that are effective, these enrichment opportunities after school and summer are closely integrated with the core curriculum. They're not add-ons, they're not different. They're a part of a very coherent, well-constructed strategy to teach these skills to all children. That's a very rare after-school program that looks like that.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we've run out of time. We appreciate great questions from the audience. I want to ask you to please join me in thanking our authors and our panelists. Thank you very much, and good luck with the elements.